When one first lays eyes upon the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, the immediate impression is not merely of a prison. It is of a fortress, a monument designed to project both power and permanence. From the moment construction began in the late 19th century, every stone placed in its walls carried a deeper message. This was not just a place to hold men. It was a structure that symbolized the federal government's resolve to dominate lawlessness itself. The architecture of Leavenworth was deeply symbolic, a reflection of both authority and psychology. Designed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, its appearance borrowed from the imposing Gothic and Romanesque styles that were popular in fortress and cathedral design. Thick limestone walls, narrow vertical windows, and massive arched doorways were not only architectural features, they were statements. These design elements communicated an unspoken warning that strength resided here and weakness would be crushed by it. Built almost entirely from limestone quarried on site, the very material of Leavenworth tied it to the land of Kansas itself. This choice was intentional. Limestone, dense and unyielding, was a physical embodiment of durability and endurance. Prisoners, forced to extract, haul and carve these heavy stones, participated in building a structure that would outlast them all. The symbolism was haunting. The criminals themselves became the architects of their confinement. As the penitentiary's great walls rose higher, its presence became unmistakable. Towering watchtowers loomed over the landscape, visible from miles away. Each tower was equipped with armed guards who watched every movement within the prison yard and beyond. The sight of those towers, solid, ever-present, and occupied by watchful eyes, struck fear into anyone who approached. To the free citizens of Kansas, it was a reassurance of safety. To inmates, it was a constant reminder that freedom had been replaced by surveillance. Inside the prison, the architecture continued to enforce control through design. The layout was methodically organized to support maximum efficiency and minimal chaos. Cell blocks were long, narrow corridors stacked with multiple tiers of small cells. Each cell measured roughly 6 by 9 feet, barely large enough for a cot, a toilet, and a small desk. There was no privacy, no comfort, and certainly no escape. These cells were designed to strip away identity, forcing prisoners to conform to the uniform order of confinement. The heart of Leavenworth was its central dome structure, a large rotunda from which multiple corridors extended like the spokes of a wheel. This architectural layout, inspired by the radial prison design, allowed guards stationed in the center to maintain visual control over several wings simultaneously. It was a masterpiece of efficiency and dominance, a structure that merged surveillance with symbolism. Every inmate knew that even if they could not see the guard could see them. Beyond physical control, Leavenworth's design carried a psychological weight that was just as powerful. The sheer scale of the building, its thick, cold walls and echoing corridors, created an atmosphere of intimidation. The architecture was not meant to comfort, it was meant to subdue. Each sound, from the clanging of cell doors to the echo of footsteps in the hallway, reminded prisoners of their isolation and insignificance within the massive machine of justice. Even the surrounding landscape played a role in Leavenworth's symbolism. The prison was built on open Kansas plains, where the flat horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. Yet within those high limestone walls, the view of that vast openness was cut off completely. It was as if the very geography conspired with the architecture to create a paradox of space. Endless freedom just beyond reach, visible but untouchable. In many ways, the architecture of Leavenworth was the physical manifestation of America's vision of justice during the early 20th century. Stern, disciplined, and unyielding. This was a time when rehabilitation was seen as secondary to order and deterrence. The design of the prison reflected that belief. It was not built to comfort criminals but to confront them, to stand as a monument to the supremacy of law. But there was also a sense of national pride embedded in those walls. The construction of Leavenworth demonstrated the United States' growing ability to project power across its own territory, to bring organization and structure even to punishment. In an era when many state prisons were still chaotic and brutal, Leavenworth was seen as a model of federal precision and stability. Its orderly architecture reflected the federal government's promise that even in punishment there would be structure, method, and control. Architecturally, Leavenworth's influence spread across the country. Later federal prisons, including the Atlanta Penitentiary and Alcatraz, borrowed elements of its design. The idea of a secure, centralized hub surrounded by radiating cell blocks became a defining feature of the federal prison system. These later institutions would refine and modernize the approach, but the blueprint, both literally and ideologically, began with Leavenworth. Even today, standing before the penitentiary, one can feel the heavy presence of its architecture. Time has weathered the limestone, softened its sharp edges and muted the once bright steel gates, but the message remains unchanged. It is still a structure that commands respect and fear. The symmetry of its towers, the order of its walls, and the silence of its corridors continue to speak of a time when punishment was meant to be seen as power. To historians, Leavenworth's architecture tells a story not only of design but of philosophy, a philosophy of authority that believed in visible strength as a form of deterrence. To prisoners, it told another story, one of confinement so complete that even the air seemed to belong to the government. The symbolism of Leavenworth is therefore twofold. For the state, it is a proud fortress of law. For those who lived inside, it was a monument to their defeat. Every stone, every gate, and every shadow cast by its towers continues to remind the world that in the early 20th century, justice was built not just with laws, but with limestone and fear. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another deep exploration into the dark heart of America's prison history. Today we journey to Kansas, home to one of the oldest and most infamous prisons in the United States, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. This towering fortress of stone and steel has stood for more than a century, holding some of the most notorious names in American criminal history. When we talk about the story of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, we are not merely speaking of a prison made of stone and iron. We are uncovering the foundation of a system, the creation of a federal institution that defined how America would deal with its most dangerous offenders for generations to come. The origins of Leavenworth trace back to a time when the United States was transforming rapidly, the dawn of the 20th century. Industrial progress, new technology, and the growth of cities brought unprecedented change, but with that progress came an equally growing wave of crime. Local and state prisons were overcrowded, inconsistent, and often plagued by corruption and brutality. There was no standardized way to handle federal criminals, and offenders convicted under national laws were scattered across state facilities or held in poor conditions unfit for rehabilitation or justice. Recognizing this chaos, Congress approved the establishment of a federal prison system, one that would bring order, discipline, and a sense of national authority to the world of criminal justice. In this moment of reformation, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary was born. Construction began in 1897 near the town of Leavenworth, Kansas, a place already known for its military prison at Fort Leavenworth. The location was not chosen by chance. The federal government wanted a site that was centrally located in the country, isolated enough for security, and surrounded by open land that could be used for prison labor and self-sustainability. The idea was not only to punish but to reform, to make inmates work, build discipline, and contribute to the construction of the very walls that would confine them. And so, with labor provided by prisoners themselves, Leavenworth began to rise, brick by brick, stone by stone. The inmates quarried the limestone, carried the blocks, and built their own cages. It was both poetic and tragic, the symbol of man shaping his own captivity. When the penitentiary officially opened in 1903, it became the first large federal prison in American history. Its architecture alone was a statement of power: massive limestone walls, guard towers piercing the Kansas sky, and rows of barred windows that gave it the appearance of a fortress. The design sent a message to the nation: the era of uncoordinated, lenient punishment was over. The federal government now had its own stronghold, one that could house those who challenged its laws and authority. But beyond the walls and gates, Leavenworth represented something deeper: the birth of centralized federal justice. Before Leavenworth, criminal punishment varied wildly between states. One state might treat offenders with relative leniency, while another imposed extreme conditions. With the creation of this penitentiary, the United States introduced a new standard, a model for discipline, order, and correction that would later inspire the construction of other federal facilities like Atlanta and Alcatraz. Inside Leavenworth's early walls, life was designed to break defiance and build obedience. The daily routine was strict, almost military in nature: early wake-ups, long hours of labor, silence in corridors, and rigid schedules for meals and rest. Every aspect of prison life was designed to create structure in men who once lived in chaos. This concept was revolutionary for its time, combining punishment with reform through hard work and control. For the first few decades, Leavenworth operated as the flagship of the federal prison system, a place where the Bureau of Prisons tested its policies and methods. It was both a laboratory for social control and a reflection of America's evolving view of justice. By the 1920s and 1930s, it became home to some of the most infamous figures in the country: gangsters from the Prohibition era, corrupt politicians, murderers, and bank robbers. The government's most wanted were now under one roof, guarded by the newly professionalized federal correctional staff. Leavenworth's role went far beyond confinement. It became a training ground for wardens, guards, and administrators who would later oversee other prisons across the nation. Its records, procedures, and policies helped shape the entire Bureau of Prisons, which officially formed in 1930. In this sense, Leavenworth was more than a place. It was the blueprint of an institution. The federal system's emergence through Leavenworth also reflected a shift in public perception of justice. Before its establishment, prisons were often seen as purely punitive, places of suffering and isolation. But the federal approach introduced by Leavenworth emphasized efficiency, structure, and moral correction through discipline. This balance between control and reform would become the cornerstone of American corrections for much of the 20th century. Even in its early years, Leavenworth was a symbol that stretched far beyond Kansas. Newspapers across the country wrote about its construction, its inmates, and its reputation for being unbreakable. For many Americans, it stood as the physical embodiment of federal power, the ultimate destination for those who had crossed the line of national law. In many ways, the story of Leavenworth is the story of the United States learning to govern not just its free citizens but also its lawbreakers. It marked a turning point in the nation's belief that crime could not simply be punished locally, it had to be managed federally with the same order, hierarchy, and permanence that defined the country itself. By the time the Bureau of Prisons expanded to include new facilities in Atlanta, Lewisburg, and later Alcatraz, the foundation had already been laid by Leavenworth's walls. Every policy, every regulation, every principle of federal incarceration found its roots in Kansas, where the first great experiment in organized punishment began. Leavenworth stood as the model, a monument to the nation's evolving understanding of law, justice, and human control. Its story is not just one of confinement, but of creation. The moment America decided that justice would no longer be fragmented by state lines, but unified under one federal banner. If the walls of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary could speak, they would whisper the stories of some of the most notorious figures in American criminal history. For more than a century, its cold limestone corridors have contained men whose names once dominated newspaper headlines, spread fear through cities, and defined eras of lawlessness. To step inside Leavenworth was, for many, to step from the world of infamy into the shadow of silence. From the early 1900s through the Prohibition era and beyond, Leavenworth became a gathering place for legends of crime. Men who once commanded gangs, smuggled fortunes, and defied the law on a national scale. Here within these walls, power met its limits. One of the most famous inmates ever to walk Leavenworth's corridors was George "Machine Gun" Kelly, the infamous gangster whose name became synonymous with the roaring criminal age of the 1930s. Known for his bold kidnappings and his signature Thompson submachine gun, Kelly embodied the chaotic spirit of the Prohibition era, ruthless, ambitious, and fearless. After his arrest for the 1933 kidnapping of oil magnate Charles F. Urschel, Kelly was sentenced to life in prison. His capture was a national spectacle, and his arrival at Leavenworth marked a turning point in the prison's history. Inside those walls, the once feared Machine Gun Kelly was stripped of his power and reduced to just another number in the system. Reports from guards and other inmates described him as polite, even soft-spoken, a far cry from the mythic outlaw persona created by the media. Yet his presence alone gave Leavenworth a kind of celebrity status among American prisons. It was here that legends were not born, but broken. Another dark and unforgettable figure confined within Leavenworth's cells was Carl Panzram, one of the most violent and disturbing criminals in American history. Panzram was no ordinary prisoner. He was the embodiment of hatred itself, a man who openly declared war against humanity. His criminal record stretched from theft and arson to multiple murders across several states and countries. When Panzram arrived at Leavenworth in the 1920s, the prison staff quickly realized they were dealing with someone beyond reform. He refused to be tamed, fought guards, attacked other inmates, and often expressed his contempt for life itself. He once wrote in his memoirs, smuggled from his cell, "I am not the least bit sorry. I wish the whole human race had one neck and I had my hands on it." Those chilling words, born inside the walls of Leavenworth, revealed the darkness that even the strongest walls could not contain. Panzram's story became part of the prison's grim folklore, a reminder that Leavenworth did not just hold criminals, but monsters shaped by brutality, vengeance, and despair. His violent behavior eventually led to his transfer to another facility, where he was executed in 1930, but his ghost lingered within the mythology of Leavenworth's halls for decades. The penitentiary also became a temporary home for members of organized crime families who defined the underworld of early 20th century America. During the height of Prohibition, Leavenworth's population swelled with bootleggers, racketeers, and mafia lieutenants, many of them connected to notorious figures like Al Capone and Lucky Luciano. For these men, crime was not just survival, it was a business empire. In the mess halls and prison yards of Leavenworth, these gangsters found themselves alongside murderers, bank robbers, and common thieves. The power dynamics within the walls mirrored the streets they once ruled. Alliances formed, hierarchies emerged, and secret deals continued even from behind bars. The federal government may have confined their bodies, but their influence often seeped beyond the prison gates. One of the more fascinating inmates was Roy Gardner, a daring train and mail robber known as the last great outlaw. Gardner's exploits were the stuff of legend. Multiple successful robberies, bold escapes, and an uncanny ability to outsmart the authorities. When he was finally captured and sent to Leavenworth, he was regarded as one of the most dangerous escape artists in the country. True to his reputation, Gardner attempted to break free several times, each attempt further cementing his myth as a master of defiance. Beyond gangsters and killers, Leavenworth also held political prisoners and war resistors, especially during World War I and the Red Scare. Among them was Eugene V. Debs, a prominent socialist leader who was imprisoned for speaking out against the war. His confinement at Leavenworth transformed the prison into a stage for national debate over free speech and dissent. From his cell, Debs wrote powerful letters defending democracy and liberty, words that would later inspire movements across America. This unique mixture of inmates, from violent killers to political idealists, gave Leavenworth an identity unlike any other prison. It wasn't just a house of punishment, it was a reflection of America's social and moral contradictions. Inside its walls were men who broke laws for power and profit, and others who broke them for principle and protest. By the 1940s and 1950s, Leavenworth had solidified its reputation as the centerpiece of the federal prison system, a place where the government sent those it most feared, despised, or sought to silence. To the outside world, it was a symbol of federal might. To those within, it was a labyrinth of broken dreams, rebellion, and remorse. Each inmate who passed through its gates added another layer to its legend. Their names, once headlines of crime, became whispers in the corridors, reminders of the thin line between fame and infamy, power and imprisonment. Leavenworth's roster of inmates reads like a dark encyclopedia of American crime. It tells the story of a nation wrestling with its own capacity for greed, violence, and rebellion. And within its walls, even the most feared men in America learned that there was one power greater than their own, the unyielding authority of the state, carved into stone and silence. Life inside Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary was not simply about confinement, it was about control. Every inch of the prison, every sound, every movement, was designed to enforce a single message: you no longer belong to yourself. You belong to the system. From the moment an inmate passed through the massive iron gates, the outside world ceased to exist. Names were stripped away and replaced with numbers. Freedom of choice, of speech, of thought, all dissolved into a daily rhythm dictated by bells, whistles, and guards' commands. At Leavenworth, discipline was not just expected, it was enforced with precision. The day began before sunrise. The clang of steel doors echoed through the stone corridors as inmates were ordered to stand for count, an early morning ritual that reaffirmed the state's control. Silence was mandatory, communication was limited to the essentials. Any deviation, a word spoken out of turn, a defiant glance, a delayed movement, could lead to punishment. After roll call came work. For most prisoners, labor was the central part of life at Leavenworth. The prison operated like a self-contained world. Inside its walls existed factories, workshops, a power plant, a bakery, and even a tailor shop. Inmates made furniture, shoes, uniforms, and tools for government use. The philosophy behind this system was simple. Work would build character and reduce idleness, a dangerous enemy in any prison. But for many, the work was grueling. Hours were long, supervision was strict, and mistakes were not tolerated. Guards monitored every movement, and even the smallest infraction could earn an inmate a trip to solitary confinement, the hole. In that dark, narrow cell, light was scarce, food was minimal, and silence was absolute. It was said that some men entered the hole and came out broken, their minds shattered by isolation. Mealtimes were the only moments of pause, but even then, structure ruled. Prisoners ate in complete silence, seated in precise rows under the watchful eyes of armed guards perched above. The food was basic: beans, bread, stew, coffee, Yet the monotony was intentional. In Leavenworth, luxury did not exist. Uniformity was the rule. Recreation was limited. On rare occasions, inmates were allowed into the yard for brief periods of exercise. But the open air was surrounded by high limestone walls and guard towers, a constant reminder that the world beyond was unreachable. Some prisoners walked in endless circles. Others stared silently at the sky, trying to remember what freedom felt like. At night, when the cell doors slammed shut, the prison transformed into a world of echoes, the rattle of metal, the faint murmur of distant voices, and the occasional cry of despair. Each cell was a box of solitude. The narrow cot, the thin blanket, the small steel toilet, everything served as a reminder of the life left behind. Yet within these harsh conditions, inmates formed an unspoken social order. Hierarchies developed based on strength, reputation, and the currency of respect. The powerful, often former gangsters or seasoned criminals, dominated the weaker ones. Deals were made in whispers, loyalty was earned in silence, and betrayal could mean a beating or worse. Despite the strictness of the system, human nature found its ways of survival. Some prisoners sought refuge in religion. The prison chapel became a sanctuary for those who sought redemption or peace. Others turned to education. Leavenworth was one of the first federal prisons to offer literacy classes and vocational training, allowing inmates to learn trades that might help them after release. Still, for most, survival meant adapting to the rhythm of control, obeying, enduring, and waiting. The prison's design and routine aimed not only to punish but to reprogram behavior. Inmates were taught to move, eat, and speak according to the system's rhythm, stripping away individuality until only obedience remained. Leavenworth's wardens often described the prison as a city of silence. And indeed, silence was its greatest weapon. Unlike chaos-driven state prisons, Leavenworth operated with military precision. Orders were barked but rarely challenged. Inmates marched in step, meals were consumed wordlessly, and the sound of silence became the loudest noise of all. There were few escapes. The limestone walls and constant patrols made the prison nearly impenetrable. Those who dared to defy the system usually paid a high price. Some were caught and beaten, others were killed attempting to flee. The walls of Leavenworth did not just confine, they crushed the will to run. But even under this regime of order, tension was always present. The mixture of hardened criminals, mobsters, and desperate men created an invisible pressure that could erupt without warning. Fights broke out in the workshops, riots flared in the yard, and guards learned never to let their guard down. To survive at Leavenworth, both inmate and officer had to understand the unwritten rule: respect the order or the order will destroy you. Over time, Leavenworth's routine became legendary, a model replicated in other federal prisons. Its daily structure of work, silence, and control became the blueprint for federal correctional discipline. The government presented it as proof that crime could be contained, and chaos could be ordered through strict regulation and relentless supervision. But to those who lived it, life inside Leavenworth was something else entirely. It was a test of endurance, physical, mental, and spiritual. Each day blended into the next, and time itself seemed to lose meaning. The men who entered often left changed if they left at all. Leavenworth's system worked not because of its walls or guards, but because it understood something fundamental about human nature, that control of the body eventually leads to control of the mind. The architecture, the silence, the discipline, all worked together to break resistance and build conformity. Inside those limestone walls, the air was heavy with regret, fear, and routine. It was a place where defiance faded into obedience, and where the strongest lesson was not spoken but lived. The system always wins. Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary was built to be unbreakable, a monument of stone, steel, and authority. Its high limestone walls, armed towers, and disciplined guards made it one of the most secure prisons in the United States. But even in a fortress designed for total control, there were always men who believed that no wall could hold them. Inside those cold corridors, where hope was a rare currency, the dream of escape burned quietly, a secret rebellion against the system itself. From the early 1900s onward, escape attempts became part of Leavenworth's hidden history, a story written in risk, blood, and ingenuity. For every prisoner who accepted his fate, there was another who studied the routines, memorized the guard shifts, and stared at the walls not with fear, but with calculation. The first major escape attempt came not long after the prison's completion. In 1906, a group of inmates working outside the main yard managed to overpower an unarmed guard and flee into the Kansas countryside. They didn't get far. Within days, all were captured, exhausted and hungry, wandering through the open plains. That early attempt taught the world a lesson. Leavenworth was not a place one could simply walk away from. But the human spirit, especially the desperate one, rarely accepts defeat. As the decades passed, inmates grew bolder and smarter. They studied the prison's architecture, learned the habits of guards, and communicated through coded messages hidden in work orders or books. Every rumor of an escape spread like wildfire through the cell blocks, feeding both hope and paranoia. One of the most famous escape attempts in Leavenworth's history came in 1931, involving the legendary outlaw Roy Gardner, the king of the escape artists. Gardner, already famous for multiple successful breakouts from other prisons, was transferred to Leavenworth after being deemed too dangerous for state custody. To the wardens, Gardner was a challenge. To the inmates, he was a hero. Gardner immediately began plotting. Using his job in the prison industries, he studied the movement of guards and the structure of the prison gates. He crafted a plan involving smuggled tools and time distractions. When his chance came, he acted, leaping over a wall during a work detail and sprinting across open ground toward the outer fence. Guards shouted. Guns fired. Gardner made it past the first barrier but was brought down by a rifle shot before he reached the fields. His bid for freedom ended in blood and dust. Gardner's failure didn't stop others. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Leavenworth faced a series of small-scale escape attempts. Some daring, others foolish. Prisoners tried digging tunnels, hiding in supply wagons, even disguising themselves as workers. But the prison's military precision and layered security almost always ensured recapture. Every time an escape was attempted, the rules grew tighter. The towers gained more guards. The spotlights burned brighter. The punishment for even planning an escape became severe. For those caught, the consequences were brutal. Many were sent to solitary confinement for months, a punishment known among inmates as the hole. Some were transferred to higher security facilities such as Alcatraz, which was designed specifically to house the most incorrigible escape artists. Leavenworth became the proving ground for these men. If they couldn't be controlled here, they were sent to the Rock. Still, the hunger for freedom was relentless. Inmates developed creative ways to outsmart the system. Some faked illnesses to reach the prison hospital, where security was lighter. Others tried to manipulate sympathetic guards. There were even cases where prisoners attempted to use the cover of storms to mask their movements. A few made it past the walls, but the vast plains surrounding the prison offered no cover. The open fields of Kansas became the prison's greatest ally, a natural barrier that exposed every fleeing figure against the horizon. By the 1950s, technology had advanced. Electrified fences, motion-sensitive lights, and improved surveillance systems made escape nearly impossible. Yet in 1958, one of Leavenworth's most dramatic incidents occurred when a group of inmates launched a violent breakout attempt from inside the industrial workshop. They managed to seize tools, threaten guards, and start a small riot in an effort to breach the main gates. The chaos lasted less than an hour. Reinforcements from nearby Fort Leavenworth stormed in, subduing the prisoners with tear gas and gunfire. 2 inmates died, several were injured, and the rest were sent into solitary. The prison tightened its grip even further after that day. In later decades, escape attempts shifted from physical to psychological. Inmates knew the odds were nearly impossible, so some turned their efforts inward, through manipulation, deception, and exploitation of the system. A few attempted to escape through forged documents or stolen uniforms. One inmate famously impersonated a guard during an early 1970s shift change and nearly made it out before being recognized at the outer checkpoint. The stories of escape, both successful and failed, became part of Leavenworth's mythology. They represented more than just acts of defiance. They were expressions of the human desire for freedom, the same impulse that no wall could completely suppress. Guards understood this too. Many long-serving officers at Leavenworth described the strange tension that filled the prison at night. The quiet hum of plotting minds, the ever-present sense that someone, somewhere, was watching and waiting for an opportunity. Each failed attempt led to new measures, new routines, and stricter rules. By the end of the 20th century, Leavenworth had earned a reputation as one of the most escape-proof prisons in the country. Its transformation from a maximum security stronghold to a medium security facility came not from weakness, but from evolution, a reflection of how security and control had advanced to the point that physical walls were almost symbolic. In the end, the escapes from Leavenworth, whether real, attempted, or imagined, revealed something deeper about the nature of confinement. No matter how high the walls or how watchful the guards, the dream of freedom remained alive in every prisoner's heart. Each plan, each attempt, was a spark of rebellion against the system's total authority. And though the walls always won, those sparks ensured that Leavenworth's legend was never silent. By the early 20th century, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary had become more than a prison. It was a statement. A symbol of federal authority rising from the heart of Kansas, it embodied America's growing ambition to create a unified system of justice that could contain its most dangerous citizens. Before Leavenworth, the idea of federal prison barely existed. Criminals convicted under federal law were often housed in state facilities or local jails, scattered and inconsistent. There was no single standard of control, no central management, just a patchwork of borrowed cells and improvised discipline. Leavenworth changed that forever. Its construction, beginning in 1897, represented the federal government's first serious step toward establishing its own correctional network. The choice of location was strategic, a place already home to Fort Leavenworth, one of America's oldest military installations. The federal government saw the potential, a vast, secure area with an existing military presence, ideal for managing both soldiers and civilians under strict supervision. At first, the prison operated under the supervision of the U.S. Army. Soldiers acted as guards, and military efficiency shaped its early culture. The routines were rigid, the rules absolute. Inmates marched in line, ate in silence, and worked in stone quarries or factories designed to teach discipline through labor. But as the prison population expanded, filled increasingly with bank robbers, bootleggers, and organized crime figures, it became clear that a new kind of institution was needed. In 1906, control was transferred from the military to the newly formed Federal Bureau of Prisons, BOP, though it would not be officially established by that name until 1930. This transfer marked a turning point in American corrections. Leavenworth became the testing ground for policies, procedures, and philosophies that would later define the entire federal prison system. Every practice, from inmate classification to labor management, was studied, refined, and eventually replicated nationwide. Leavenworth's transformation was both practical and symbolic. The architecture itself told a story of evolving power. Its massive stone walls and watchtowers reflected 19th-century ideals of punishment through isolation and labor. But inside, the administration began to explore a new idea, the reformation of the criminal mind. Wardens experimented with educational programs, work incentives, and limited privileges. While the outside world saw Leavenworth as a fortress of iron control, inside, it was quietly becoming a laboratory for federal correctional policy. During the 1920s and 1930s, the height of Prohibition and the Gangster era, Leavenworth became the centerpiece of federal justice. As crime surged across America, the need for consistent sentencing and secure facilities became urgent. Men like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and members of the Murder Incorporated syndicate drew national headlines, and the public demanded stronger measures. Leavenworth, already housing hundreds of notorious figures, became the face of this new era of law enforcement. In those years, Leavenworth's reputation spread far beyond Kansas. It became known as the crown jewel of federal prisons. Judges across the nation would utter its name during sentencing with a kind of finality, a signal that the offender's journey through the justice system had reached its ultimate end. "You're going to Leavenworth" became one of the most feared phrases in the American legal vocabulary. But the rise of organized crime also exposed the prison's limits. By the late 1930s, Leavenworth was overcrowded. Despite its massive walls, it was not built for the kind of criminal empires now being sent there. The gangsters were rich, influential, and resourceful, often finding ways to bribe guards, control contraband, and continue operations from behind bars. The need for an even more isolated, escape-proof, and corruption-resistant prison became evident. The need gave birth to Alcatraz. When the federal government decided to convert the island prison in San Francisco Bay into a maximum security facility, much of its design philosophy came directly from Leavenworth. The Kansas prison had provided decades of data: how inmates behaved under long-term isolation, what security measures worked, and how organized criminals manipulated the system. The Bureau of Prisons used these lessons to design a facility where communication, escape, and corruption were nearly impossible. In a sense, Leavenworth was the blueprint, the foundation upon which Alcatraz was built. Yet even as Alcatraz rose to infamy, Leavenworth remained the heart of the federal system. It continued to train wardens, guards, and administrators who would later oversee other federal institutions. Policies developed within its walls became federal law. The prison's files and reports shaped the BOP's early mission, to balance discipline with rehabilitation, control with reform. By mid-century, Leavenworth had evolved once again. The brutality of early punishments gave way to structured routines, vocational training, and psychological evaluation. Wardens like James Bennett, who later became the director of the Bureau of Prisons, emphasized humane treatment and education as tools of reform. The shift was slow and imperfect. Corruption, violence, and racial tension still haunted the prison, but the intent was clear. Leavenworth was no longer just a place of punishment. It was becoming a model for a new vision of federal corrections. Through the decades, Leavenworth remained a mirror of America's changing justice system. During the Cold War, it housed spies and traitors. During the Civil Rights era, it held political radicals. Each period left its mark, reshaping policies and priorities. By the 1990s, the facility had transitioned from maximum to medium security, reflecting a more modern philosophy, one that sought to separate high-risk offenders from the general population while still maintaining the traditions that had defined it for over a century. Leavenworth's transformation from a stone fortress to a national institution represents more than the evolution of a single prison. It tells the story of how the United States built its federal correctional identity, a system that today manages hundreds of facilities across the nation. The principles forged inside Leavenworth's walls, structure, discipline, reform, still echo through the entire Bureau of Prisons. Even now, its towers rise above the Kansas landscape, silent witnesses to a century of change. The men who once guarded and governed it may be gone, the inmates long released or buried, but the legacy remains unshaken. Leavenworth was the beginning, the crucible in which the modern federal prison system was born. Today, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary stands as both a relic and a reminder, a living monument to more than a century of American justice. Its limestone walls, once the pinnacle of federal authority, now rise quietly over the Kansas plains, overlooking a modern world that has changed in ways its original builders could never have imagined. But inside those same walls, the echoes of history still resonate, whispers of reform, rebellion, punishment, and survival. Leavenworth's modern identity is complex. Once the most feared name in the American prison system, it has gradually transformed into something far more symbolic. A bridge between the old philosophy of hard punishment and the new vision of structured rehabilitation. The Leavenworth of today is no longer the fortress of pain it was in the early 1900s, but neither has it shed its past entirely. The air still carries the weight of legacy, a reminder of the countless lives that passed through its gates, each one shaped, scarred, or hardened by its power. In the early 2000s, the facility underwent major changes. The original U.S. Penitentiary Leavenworth was officially redesignated as a medium-security prison, and a new high-security facility, United States Penitentiary Leavenworth (USP Leavenworth), was constructed nearby to house more dangerous inmates. This marked the beginning of a new era, one defined by tighter classification, advanced technology, and more strategic inmate management. Where once sheer walls and armed guards were enough, now digital surveillance, motion detection, and data-driven risk assessment have become the tools of control. Despite these changes, the prison's mission remains rooted in the principles that shaped it a century ago: discipline, responsibility, and reform. Educational programs, job training, and substance abuse treatment now coexist with security protocols. The modern Leavenworth emphasizes preparing inmates for re-entry into society, a concept that would have been unthinkable in its earliest days. But the transformation wasn't just institutional, it was cultural. The same prison that once held Prohibition-era gangsters and wartime spies now houses a mix of drug offenders, white-collar criminals, and those serving moderate federal sentences. Still, Leavenworth's name carries a unique weight. In American culture, it has become synonymous with punishment, a metaphor for justice served. Television, film, and literature have immortalized its image as the quintessential federal prison. From gangster stories to courtroom dramas, the phrase "sent to Leavenworth" still sends a chill down the spine. It's a reminder that behind every sentence lies a place built to contain the consequences of crime. But beyond Hollywood's fascination lies the deeper truth. Leavenworth is a reflection of America itself, its evolving views on justice, morality, and redemption. Each era has left a distinct imprint on its philosophy. The early 20th century believed in punishment through labor. The mid-century sought reform through structure, and today the focus has shifted toward rehabilitation and re-entry. Through it all, Leavenworth adapted, survived, and continued to serve as a pillar of the federal prison system. Modern Leavenworth operates not in isolation, but as part of a vast network managed by the Federal Bureau of Prisons (BOP). Its influence extends through every corner of the system, in policy, design, and administration. Wardens trained here have gone on to lead institutions across the country, carrying with them the discipline and pragmatism forged inside its walls. The very structure of federal incarceration, from inmate intake to psychological evaluation, still bears the fingerprints of Leavenworth's century-long evolution. Yet, for all its modernization, Leavenworth hasn't escaped controversy. Questions about overcrowding, inmate violence, and the effectiveness of rehabilitation persist, just as they do across the American prison landscape. The walls that once symbolized absolute security now stand as a mirror to the nation's ongoing debate about the balance between punishment and mercy. To some, Leavenworth represents the unyielding strength of law. To others, it stands as a cautionary monument, a reminder that justice must evolve alongside society. Perhaps the most striking transformation lies not within the prison itself, but in the town of Leavenworth, Kansas. The city has grown around the institution, its economy and identity intertwined with the penitentiary. For locals, the prison is both a source of employment and a constant reminder of history. It stands on the edge of town like an old sentinel, weathered, silent, and watchful. Generations of families have worked there, their lives connected by the rhythm of its sirens, shifts, and stories. Today, visitors to the area often stop to photograph the massive facade, the arched gatehouse, the looming towers, the weathered stone that glows golden at sunset. To the untrained eye, it may seem like just another government building. But for historians, criminologists, and those who know its past, it is a living museum, a monument to the birth and growth of federal corrections in the United States. Every stone tells a story, of the men who built it by hand, the convicts who labored inside, the wardens who ruled it, and the lawmakers who shaped its destiny. In many ways, Leavenworth's greatest legacy is not the criminals it held, but the system it inspired. It became the prototype for federal justice, a model that demonstrated how structure, order, and governance could transform chaos into control. Its lessons, learned through decades of trial and error, still guide modern correctional theory. Even as new facilities rise with high-tech walls and biometric gates, the foundational principles remain the same, principles born inside Leavenworth's walls. As it stands today, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary is both past and present, a bridge between the brutality of early incarceration and the possibility of modern rehabilitation. Its towers no longer loom as threats but as reminders of endurance, transformation, and the relentless pursuit of justice. And perhaps that is the most powerful legacy of all. Leavenworth was built to contain men, but in doing so, it helped define a nation's conscience. Through every riot, reform, and reconstruction, it has endured, not just as a place of confinement, but as a symbol of the American struggle between punishment and redemption.